Remembrance Sunday always registers with me, and more times than I can count I've watched the ceremonials that play out at the Cenotaph in Whitehall, and some years when our kids were younger we would walk them up to the local war memorial here in Stirling, and we would be there for the ceremony that played out there in front of us. My grandfathers, as I've written and spoken about many times, both fought in and survived the First World War, and I feel a strong sense of connection to it, and it's always been one of the underpinnings of why I'm interested in and moved by stories from history. But my thoughts about it don't remain the same. They have evolved down through the years, and I suppose as I get older and as I watch my kids grow up and so on, my reflection on the nature of that day, my reflections and thoughts change. And by now, with every passing year, I wonder, and with ever increasing sadness is the best word, I think, I wonder what it is we mean by remembrance. I mean, if you look remembrance up in a dictionary, it'll say something like the reach of memory. It's something as kind of amorphous and esoteric as that. But we know what remembrance is, in as much as we know it's got something to do with thinking about the dead of war. But I mean, in the modern sense, the ceremonies of remembrance that we observe now in November, they followed World War I, the First World War, the Great War, whatever you want to call it, and it was because it had caused death on an unprecedented scale. Well over 1 million for Britain and her empire. I think the official figure's 1.1 million. And at that time, 1914 say, if you look at census information, Britain's population in 1914, there or thereabouts, was around 40 million. So significantly fewer people than live here today, and yet, 1 million down. And the British policy of burying the dead where they fell, rather than repatriating them, had been both practical and political. And you can imagine the logistics of what would have been required to bring everyone home and then get them to where they came from. So the decision was taken, but it was also political, because there were real, unspoken concerns that if all the coffins came back and the people saw them piling up, that there might have been a revolution. There might have been demands, at the very least, for an end to the slaughter. As I said previously, getting absolute figures for the casualties, for the deaths of the First World War is very difficult, okay? But during the Boer War, the war previous, the death toll was about 10 a day. 10 men dead. During the First World War, averaged out, the Allied death toll was over 5,000 a day. Think about that. Every day for 4 years, 5,000 men and boys blown to bits. Now, you imagine if people had been aware of the real physical scale of what the meat grinder of the Western Front was producing. Well, as I say, so that was a political reason why the bodies were left behind, because they were literally saying, we can't let the people see this. Thank God they can't see it. And France was even more badly hurt. Less than a year into the fighting, France was 1 million casualties down. Either dead, in large part dead, or they were never going to fight again. Or in many cases, lead normal lives again. And that was with 3 years of the war still to go. And during the treaty talks at Versailles, so the story goes, and it's believable, there were anxious conversations about whether France had survived the war, or if it had, whether it could go on in the same form in which it had existed before the fighting started. France was bled white, and it may well be the case, believe it or believe it not, that old France, the France of 1913, did die, and that something else was made to stand up in its place and carry on. That may be the case. There's so much death, it's inconceivable for us now. And I maintain that the populations of the protagonist countries were permanently damaged by that war. Britain, France, Germany, and so on. And that the wounds are still there, open. And that all the trouble since, and all the trouble now, is a consequence, directly or indirectly, of what was unleashed on humankind between 1914 and 1918. I mean, that's how I see it. But to get back to that policy of burial on the battlefield, it meant that for the vast, I mean, there were a few exceptions. You know, a couple of, you'll see in graveyards around the country, those familiar gravestones of Portland stone, you know, that are maintained by the War Graves Commission. Some people died while they were home, and so were. But the policy of burial on the battlefield meant that for by far the majority of people, there was no grave to visit. There was nowhere to go and grieve. So they were in a limbo, a hellish limbo. They knew their son or their father or their brother or their husband or whatever was dead, but they might never get to see a grave. You know, international travel, as it were, not being as available to people then as it is now. And so that was what inspired the war memorials, 30-odd thousand of them around Britain. The greatest public art project in history. None of those, they weren't commissioned by the government. That was every individual community that had seen loss, had experienced loss, commissioned an artist to create a memorial for them, and they raised the funds to pay for it themselves. And it was nearly 40,000 of them in the end. It was nothing, again, unprecedented. But the 11th of November 1919 was the first anniversary of the armistice, which was the ceasefire that brought the fighting to a halt in 1918. And France, word got back to Britain that France had organised a catafalque as the focus for their victory parade. Now, a catafalque is a temporary, it's a tomb-like structure. It's basically a table to put a coffin on, is the catafalque. And they had created this as the focal point for their victory parade in Paris. And so word of that got back to Britain, to London, to the government, and not to be outdone. There were plans hatched for something similar as the focal point of the victory parade, and so the result was the cenotaph, a word that means, or two words actually, xenos taphos, empty tomb, and it was designed by Edwin Lutyens, and it was originally built just of timber and plasterboard painted white, because it was only meant to be there for the day. And ironically, the French took one look at their own catafalque and thought it looked too German, and took it down before the parade took place. So it never actually happened in that way that had what actually inspired what happened in London. But the British cenotaph stayed, and British people became instantly attached to it. You know, all those flowers laid around it, so that it must have looked like blood pooling around the stone in slow motion. And and after the ceremony and after the day, no one wanted to see it gone, and so a permanent version was commissioned, made of Portland stone, which is the obelisk, the pylon that's there now. And it was done really quickly, and it was ready for Armistice Day the following year. But most conspicuous in many ways when it comes to contemplating remembrance and what it all meant, what is conspicuously absent from the cenotaph is there's no religious symbolism at all. There's not so much as a Christian cross. It's just two carved laurel wreaths and the words, "the glorious dead." That's it. It's absent of symbolism, as though no one could think what you could possibly say. And maybe the very idea of putting a cross on it just bothered Lutyens, but it's very interesting anyway just to contemplate how blank it is. It's just a gravestone. And I mean, in his own words, Lutyens described it as an empty tomb uplifted on a high pedestal, which is what it is. So death tolls for something like the First World War, they're hard to come by. You can't necessarily rely on the accuracy of them, but something like 20 million men and boys died. 20 million. And the same again, another 20 million were injured, carrying wounds for the rest of their lives. Missing limbs, blinded, scarred beyond recognition, crippled, And Fabian Ware, who was the head of the Imperial War Graves Commission, which became the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, he calculated, sort of back of an envelope style, that if the million dead of Britain and the Empire were somehow to stand up from their graves and march 4 abreast down Whitehall, it would take them 3.5 days to pass the cenotaph. You try and visualise that. All dead. All gone. And then on it went. You know, within 20 years later, it was World War II. Because of World War I. World War I caused World War II. And something like 85 million died in World War II, which is 3% of the population of the planet at the time. 3%. 3 in every 100 people alive died. And I go looking. I invite you to go looking at the numbers. The American Civil War of the 1860s, which is the deadliest in US history, saw to the ending of at least 620,000 men and boys. Some estimates push it up to 850,000. Now that was America in the 1860s, with the population that it had then. If such a conflict unfolded in America now, with the modern population, the death toll would be 6 million. Think of that. And I mean, you know, and well, something like, let's say, the partition of India, right, at the end of the Raj in 1947, it saw as many as 18 million people on the move, you know, getting out of, well, India and into Pakistan, or out of Pakistan and into India. And it caused conflict, and people were being attacked as they moved between areas. And when all was said and done, 1 million were dead, just as a result of the compulsory movement of the partitioning of India. And it never ends. Figures for the death toll of the war on terror, as if you can make war on terror, you might as well make war on sadness. But the figures are, again, hard to pin down, but conservative estimates say 5 million dead, and maybe double that, maybe 10 million. That's civilians, for in large part. 10 million because of the war on terror. And more and more, it's the case that modern conflicts harvest civilians in greater proportion to fighting soldiers, because the wars are all fought from the air and from remotely, drones and all of the rest of it, and it's civilians that die, children, women. And so I ask again, what is it that we remember? What is it that we remember on the day that we call Remembrance Day? Because surely some of it ought to be about remembering how much unshakable grief is caused by every death, every violent death like that. People that ought to be alive but die, or murdered, you might say, because of conflict. And something about remembering the dead, the glorious dead of the past, while bombs are raining down on civilians in the Holy Land, it feels uncomfortable to me. And right now, the list of countries at war, I looked this up, is Afghanistan, Algeria, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Iraq, Ivory Coast, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Mexico, Mozambique, Myanmar, Niger, Nigeria, Russia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, Ukraine and Yemen. In some sort of war, civil war, terrorist insurgency, or outright war. Wars are declared by old men, and then young men and boys die in their thousands, hundreds of thousands, and in their millions, and they die alongside millions of civilians, children included, over and over again. So what are we remembering every year in November? What is it we remember? And you know, I'm no pacifist. I would fight. I would hope it's never tested, but I would fight and kill without compunction to protect my family. But I also feel the need to fight those who would, at the drop of a hat, send my sons to fight in foreign wars, so that those old men and their sponsors can make more money and gain more power and control. We are via the rituals of remembrance, encouraged, amongst other things, to support and celebrate the very establishment that blatantly promotes war for profit at the expense of the lives of millions of people. War creates and perpetuates chaos, which is what those same vicious old men want to inflict on populations, because while war lasts, we are distracted. We're not paying attention to what they're doing to us while we're all at each other's throats. But we are not a species that remembers, not in any meaningful way. We're a species that forgets, helplessly forgets. Henri Bergson, French philosopher, said it's the function of the brain to enable us not to remember but to forget. And so it is. Those who remember war, having fought in a war, are often inclined to see it for what it is. In a book called Tommy, the British Soldier on the Western Front, by author and historian Richard Holmes, there's his line, "Many of those who came to look upon the war as waste and sham did so not at the time of the armistice, but through the lens of penury and disillusionment that characterised the post-war years for all too many of them." Penury and disillusionment. Now, those are so often the reality of the aftermath of war for those directly affected by war. It's not very glorious in the minds of those that have seen it. And as we are bled white by one war, and then the military complex, the military-industrial complex, uses up all its bullets and bombs, soon enough we, and by we I mean the peoples of the world, are swiftly ushered into the next one. And maybe that, along with our dead, those already dead, is what we should be remembering.